This is the Westside King's Church podcast, where we aim to encounter and embody the surprising grace of Jesus.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us here this evening. This is our last session of our Short Circles Growing Goodness. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm Kristen Woods, and I am associate pastor at Westside King's Church, and we're here with Phil. Phil Odd. I'm super happy that you were able to join for this conversation. Phil, you joined us on staff, I think in September, as an interim associate pastor. So yeah, I just am super excited. I've listened to your podcast quite a few times.
Boy.
Nothing but good things to say. So, Theo Imagination, that's what it is, right?
Theo Imagination, that's right.
Yeah. So super excited to have you here for this conversation today.
Excited.
What we are tasked with talking about is today is culture of service and Christlikeness to kind of close out our series. So we'll get into a bit of discussion around that. Something I wanted to start with is that in the book, A Church Called TOV, as they talk about this culture of service and nurturing a culture of service, they set it up with a really interesting image that I actually found really compelling. And it's the idea that a culture of service turns everyone toward one another instead of towards themselves. And that's thinking of sort of the leaders as that themselves. So if you think of like a regular Sunday morning, regular teaching, a lot of times, most often you walk in and that everybody's sat facing the leaders, whoever's leading on the stage. And this idea of a culture of service kind of takes that and to think about the community as turning towards one another, and that people are first, grace matters, empathy is a first response, truth is told, and doing right is what shapes the mission of the church. So I really appreciate that in the book. And I know that you were pretty looking forward to talking about this idea of nurturing service and had some ideas around that. So I'd love to hear from you, Phil, kind of your ideas around that.
Yeah. So I listened to this book for the first time. So I bought a copy kind of almost immediately when it came out, but had been doing a lot of driving. I think we were in Toronto or something. And so I listened to it, and I remember this part of the book, it's funny because I've kept wanting to go back, and this is why I hardly ever do audiobooks, because it's so hard to find, like, where was that in the book? And so when you had asked me about these two chapters and I started reading, I'm like, oh, this is the one. This is what I'm quite interested in talking about. And the reason is because I think that there's a particular danger that this chapter deals with. I think a whole book could be written on this. When we think of narcissism in the church, I think what's getting the spotlight at the moment are the loud, in your face, I'm going to yell at you, I'm going to demean you loudly in front of everybody, narcissists. And this is really important to deal with. And so I in no way want to undermine that, because I think we're learning a lot about that on different podcasts, on the rise and fall of Mars Hill, in this book. But there's another type of narcissism that can take over, and it's more hidden. And because it's more hidden, I think it's particularly dangerous. And it's and I've walked through some of this. So it's a narcissism, but through service. And because it's through service, it makes it very difficult to put your finger on, unless you're the victim of it, at which point really clearly. So I'd underlined at one point where it said, for the servant pastor, everything is different. A culture of service turns everyone towards one another, right? Which you were just referencing, instead of towards himself. And I had put, and this is only like, I think 2 pages in, and I had written caution and had circled it towards one another, like because if that's not there, we're in really dangerous territory. And so what the danger is here is that there is a type of issue where people in the name of service can literally serve everyone and everything, but they do it to be at the center and to be noticed. And so the service of it at the end of the day, it is a self-service. And like I said, it's hard for people to realize and hard for them to put their finger on unless you are the person who stands in the way of this. At which point I find that this particular character has then a very deep and bitter resentment and will undermine a culture of goodness whenever threatened by anybody from the outside. And why this is even more dangerous is because if you're the recipient of the service, it's then you're like, but this person's doing so much good for me. And so it makes gaslighting all that much more dangerous,
Right.
because everybody else is saying, well, hold on, but this seems like just such a great person. They're serving me. They're doing all these things for me all the time. But if you are the person, if they can't quite get you under them, then there is a toxicity that takes place. And so for me, Kristen, what you're saying then of this idea of being turned towards one another becomes so important. Otherwise, we're elevating a self-service. And so this is where it seems, I think part of what I liked here is that what was difficult to read, but also like, but I've seen it in these cultures, is this idea of like, so forget the volunteer appreciation banquets, forget the, volunteer of the year award, forget all of these things, because this is the subtle part here where we can really then serve to be noticed, and we foster an environment of serving to be noticed. And there are dangers in this type of serving. And so I was so glad that they dealt with this, because I have seen this, and it is, if you happen to be on the resentful side of this equation, it can be a very dark and damaging thing. And so this to me balanced out the book a lot and balanced out the thoughts of, yes, let's keep talking about the loud in your face thing, that we need to get rid of that and have a culture of goodness. And have a culture of service. But let's also be careful that in a culture of service, that we don't then shift towards self-service in the name of other service. And there has to be, I think, markers and cautions, which I think they do. So that's kind of why I loved the beginning of that chapter.
Yeah, I think that's really profound what you're pointing out there. I'd like to dig into that just a little bit more. And I'm wondering if some of it's rooted in just the things that we celebrate, right? And that how we so easily, I think, can convince ourselves that good work is always good, right? So as long
Yes.
as we could call that work good, then it really doesn't matter how we get there. It really doesn't matter the motivations, because it's the box is being checked and the work is being done. So at the end of the day, maybe we're not as bothered about it, but I think it comes back to what we celebrate in a person or what we celebrate in a community. And what I've noticed is a lot of the time it is, these buzzwords that are like, high capacity, extrovert, like all these things that that very much make sure that those people are kind of at the center. And the book talks about that, and it's like how we create these rings of belonging then. So if you've got your extroverted, your high capacity, your like you're just, kind of like totally committed, and it doesn't really matter for what reasons type volunteers. Well, those people will automatically be kind of at the center of your organization, and then everybody else kind of moves to the fringes. So I don't know if that resonates with anything that you're saying there, Phil, or if you have anything
Oh,
to.
100%. Yeah. And I think, if you think of it then too, if the bulk of the work ends up being done, then it's harder actually to deal with as a church, because you say, but they do so much and we don't want to get rid of all the tasks that are being done. Right. And so I do think it's this issue. It's really about heart. Like, I think in the same way that they say a few times that it's not the size of the church, it's the size of the ego. Well, it's also not necessarily the size or the public nature of the role as it is, again, the ego, because the ego can come through in a myriad of ways. And so I think just markers like, and the other thing, of course, is then you can involve other people. Like there's more people who are happy to do things. But yeah, I think so, Kristen, in terms of the being cautious of what is it we're actually celebrating, right?
Yeah.
And because that good work can suddenly not be a good work. And so we have to have good filters, and discernment, I would say, too, is another key issue here. We have to be a people who discern by the Spirit what's actually going on.
Yeah, I think that's so true, Phil. And like you're saying, sort of sounds like, when we hinge a ministry, whether it's, or a church or a program or anything, off of one person and one person's, hard work and one person's skill and one person's ability, and it becomes that one person centered.
Yeah.
And everybody looks to that person to get it done and to create this amazing program, instead of like more of a collective, then maybe that
Yes.
also is part of the problem.
Oh, yeah, I think so, too. I think whenever there's a narrowing down, whenever we push people to the peripheral, we have a problem anytime. And it doesn't matter how we do it. Anytime we start seeing people, and it's easy to do, but start seeing people in the peripheral, that becomes damaging. And, years ago, I read a book by Nicholas Wolterstorff, and he's a philosopher of justice. And he was in South Africa during the height of the apartheid. And they kind of talked about this type of thing there too, in a toxic giving, that he said he witnessed people giving their trinkets, and they're giving it away. And then when they're confronted with injustice, they said, but look, we gave, they don't even appreciate, and they're not thankful for what we've done. And he says, I couldn't believe it. It was injustice being perpetuated through benevolence,
Right.
so-called benevolence, right? And so this is such a, I think, important thing, is that just because it's giving, giving can be problematic in so many ways. And so is it true benevolence? Is it good? Is it other focused? And they dealt with that whole issue of like making the poor feel poor. I heard my cousin was in town yesterday, and he does work to alleviate poverty. And he said it's amazing when you talk to actually talk to the poor. He said very rarely when you ask them to describe poverty, do they mention money. It's these other things in which they get caught. And so then we can perpetuate these things. We can perpetuate them by giving, by benevolence and whatnot.
Yeah.
So yeah,
That's really interesting. So in the book, they talk a lot about, and we've had some conversation around this, but around nurturing giftedness. And I wanted to land there just for a few minutes, because I've been doing a lot of thinking about this and kind of what that means for a community of people to nurture giftedness. And I was reading some one of Barna's studies this past week, and they surveyed pastors on giftedness within their churches, and it said 79% of pastors strongly agree, and the rest of them agreed. So essentially, almost 100% of pastors agreed that people's giftings reflect the God that created them. So there's some sort of reflection of God within people's gifting. But only 24% of those pastors said that those gifts are celebrated kind of within the church and encouraged within the church, and that only 17% of those gifts are actually encouraged outside and celebrated outside of the church. So I wanted to kind of just talk a little bit about that, and also about this. It's interesting because I think a lot of the time, in order to kind of perpetuate a serving culture, we a lot of the times think that that means, okay, let's just start programs. Like if we build it, they will come. If we create spaces, people will fill them. If we have opportunities, then people will want to serve. And I am very young still in my ministry years. I've only been, in ministry for 3 years, so I don't want to overspeak. Be too
You're never going to overspeak. Let me just interrupt and say we value your wisdom, so don't even go there.
But it strikes me that this is not the case. Building spots for people to be does not equal building a serving culture. I would love to hear your feedback and sort of your view on all that.
No, this is so good. Oh my goodness. There's so many different ways I think that we could, places we could take this, but yeah, we talk a lot about belonging, and I think belonging is important, but I think, what does it mean to belong? What does it mean? You think about Paul's, he talks about we are members of one another, which is a very different thing than being a member of Costco, right?
Yeah.
For example, to be a member of Costco, it literally is merely a transactional membership. And I think that that's what we can have in the church in terms of people coming to belong, having a space where they're, that they can show up, versus actually being involved in the life of the church, where it's back to that kind of facing towards each other, that we belong together in Christ. And I do wonder if, even talking about gifts as a whole, what we mean by that, because I think there's a way that maybe we elevate the wrong gifts. So if you think about, what is it we normally mean? I mean, what do you think? What do you think we normally mean when we talk about gifts in the church?
I think we normally mean just our natural tendency. So you've got people who are, more organized as a person. So we would say that maybe their giftedness is into like organizing groups of people, or I think we do categorize it into like maybe a bit more personality types.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes.
Yeah. So I think I completely agree. And with the filter, I mean, I think when we think of gifts in the church, what I often think of first, and I'll pick on myself here, but is music. So I've done musical stuff in churches for 20 years. So are you a gifted musician? Are you a gifted speaker? Are you highly organized, which often means organizing our programs so that the singers and musicians and speakers can do their thing. So the question for me is, where does that leave, say, a person with special needs? Where does that leave somebody who's not what society would look at and say, you're hugely gifted? If the filter for gift is the same, I think, as it is outside the church, then we're always going to run into this problem. One of the interesting things for me, as I've been dwelling on like kind of a liturgically formed, we've talked a little bit about this recently, liturgically formed worship, is it really opens up the playing field of like, the gifts of God are often, you're going to read scripture, and by the way, that's as much of an act of worship as the worship leader singing a song is an act of worship. I remember a Christmas Eve service where we had a special needs girl come up and read the Magnificat, which was so significant. You have a special needs person speaking, he has thrown the mighty down from their thrones, but he's lifted up the humble. And it's such a beautiful thing. And then I think ministry gifts, but even think about what we've done with this. And I'm totally going way too far on this whole question. But if you think about you have the fivefold ministry, and they talk a lot about, they actually reference spiritual gifts here. Think about evangelism. What do we think of when we think of an evangelist? We think of a Billy Graham. We think of people in front of huge crowds of people. It's somebody who's a good public speaker and is on a stage. Mm-hmm. And I think most of our best evangelists are not that. I think they are people who know how to be a friend. They know how to, proclaim the kingdom using natural gifts, right? It's this idea of the ordinary. That I think that's really what I'm getting at here.
Yeah.
They talk a lot about it has to be, ministry is ordinary. The only way it is extraordinary is in its ordinariness. And so I think there's a way in which we can, it's not an attempt to let's get rid of the artists, throw out the instruments, forget good public speaking. I value all of that. Yeah. But there has to be, our gift filter has to be a little bit different, I think. And then I think it'll be more of a place to be involved and not just take a seat, I guess. I don't know. Does that answer? Yeah. Have I veered too far?
No, I don't think you veered too far. And, maybe now I'm going to, take us even further, just because, personally, as a mom, I'm probably a lot of people don't know this. I'm a mom of 2 special needs kids. And so I really appreciate what you're saying, because and this is why I've always been drawn to John Swinton's work, because he works a lot with people with profound disabilities, and talking about how no worries, and he talks a lot about how the church has to be somewhere different, because the world views people like my kids and others like them in terms of what they can produce and what they can offer society and how much they can contribute to society. And it's really that upside down kingdom view to say no, what you can contribute and come up with and produce, that's not what we're going to celebrate here. And John Swinton talks in his book, Raging with Compassion, about a young girl who he said scared him because it really challenged everything he thought he knew about his belonging in the world and how much he mattered. And as an academic, he said that was really challenging for him, because it just made him question everything he kind of thought about belonging. But he said in this girl that couldn't even form words, her eyes were like oceans of compassion, right? The way she viewed the world was one of the most moving and beautiful things that he found so transformative in his own life. But that we will miss those things in people. We will walk past them. They will easily be discarded if we're not if we're not taught, or we don't understand to look for them. So I do appreciate that, Phil. I don't think you went too far. I don't know if that's, hopefully I didn't just take us off track even more.
Oh, not at all. I love where you're going with that. And I think it's desperately necessary to talk about this. Even the way that we speak about people, what a person is, plays into this. Ian McFarland, he's a scholar, and he talks about how we base, what is different about humans, and we always talk about the doing and their particular their function, and so then he says, well, what about, immediately we rule out infants, we rule out he said it's not that we have to go deeper. And so no, I think to have a goodness culture, I think this is a desperately important conversation. In fact, I think we have to have your kids, we have to have the person you just referenced in John Swinton's work. these actually have to be at the center of the conversation and not just like, let's bring them in every now and again.
Right.
Because if this stuff doesn't work for them, it's not a goodness culture. Yeah. And so that I think is a filter. And I think it's what Jesus did over and over and over again is challenged our ways of seeing, Jesus, he really did the same miracles or mighty deeds, if you will, over and over and over again, which is different than other miracle workings at the time of like extra biblical stuff. And so there's a pattern actually to Jesus' miracles. Jesus healed opened blind eyes, unstopped deaf ears, caused the lame to walk, raised the dead, cast out demons, with a few other things in there. But I think that this is actually what we need, and what I hope that this book is accomplishing, and I think it is for many of us, is in the same way that Jesus went and did the miracle of opening eyes, he taught over and over again in line with the prophets. Like, you have eyes to see what you don't see. And so we need Jesus to open our eyes to the things that we see and to bring these people into the center of the conversation, which is, I think, what he did. And I think that's the marker of goodness, I guess.
Yeah, and you also talked just a couple minutes ago about this idea of ordinariness. And Paula Gooder talks about it quite a bit, in that goodness is rooted in the ordinary, because goodness implies an ongoingness, right? Like, we don't call something good, I don't think, on a one-time kind of basis. To me, goodness means that it's something that is ongoing, it's sort of habitual, and that really speaks to, I think, the rhythm of just ordinary life, and that a lot of the time we want serving to feel heroic. We could get into whole conversations about, missions trips and all that kind of stuff. But like, I think we want that feeling, right? That we oftentimes, and that a lot of the time serving isn't heroic. A lot of the time is just family serving family, person serving person, neighbor helping neighbor, right? And that it doesn't, it is kind of gets into that idea of the mundane, which, also Tish Harrison Warren talks about a lot, like liturgy of the ordinary and life of the mundane, and this idea that goodness is really rooted in ordinary everyday life, which is what Jesus did, right? That's where he met people, in ordinary everyday life most of the time. Yeah, and I think sometimes like our culture doesn't like that word ordinary, because they attach different meanings to it, like boring or average or not good enough. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, the idea of the ordinariness of service.
Totally. Boring, by the way, is a word that did not exist until, I think, the 19th century, which is interesting, right? Because we were so desperate for things to not be boring. We didn't even think about that before. So we're working with all these other parameters now. But at the risk of like name dropping, I hope to have the opposite effect here as I say this, and it doesn't really matter because none of these people know who I am. I'll say that. I started in ministry, and I actually think this is a really dangerous thing, honestly. I started at a massive church. We set 5,000 people. We didn't have that many. We had, maybe 2,500, 3,000. But then we would have guests come in. We would, like, TD Jakes came to our church, and we had 10,000 people in the building throughout that night. And I remember, I say all of that to say, and they kind of deal with this in the book, actually, of there's a real acute danger, I think, especially for a younger person, in a culture, if we're really breeding a works-based, whatever it is, extraordinary type thing, and you're in that environment with big names, big budgets, all that kind of stuff, it's easy to breed some pretty dangerous stuff. But I remember leaving that place, and like, I came from a small Bible school in Ontario, and by small I mean like 500 people. Small, okay? And so I remember some of my friends are like, oh my goodness, TD Jakes. But I remember leaving that church and having this like reflective moment of like, what were actually the key moments for me at this church? And none of them were these when the big name people came in town and we did events with them. And what I remembered was being with my friend Paul when he was dying and being with his brothers and hanging out with them and literally being there when he had his final breath. That's what I remember. I remember seeing people in the hospital. I remember this is the ordinary stuff of life that literally every one of us goes through. And yet somehow I had eyes to see when I left that place, like that, the other stuff really, I mean, it was a one night thing. It was fun. It was cool to see a lot of people, but that wasn't the real ministry. And I'm not downplaying those people's ministry by any stretch, but it was the ordinary things I will never forget for the rest of my life, because they grabbed my heart. And if you walk with somebody through suffering, you walk with people through pain and through joys. What could be more ordinary than weeping with those who weep and rejoicing with those who rejoice? And yet those are the most extraordinary moments of life. And I also think that there are true markers of whether we're doing well, whether we have a goodness culture.
Yeah.
Weeping with those who weep in some senses is easy, although of course some pastors get too busy. They don't have time to go, somebody else do that. Right. I have important things to do. I have a sermon, right? Or whatever it is, right? But rejoicing with those who rejoice. Can you rejoice with somebody else? I mean, that is a mark of goodness. But the rejoicing is in people's ordinary moments. And to me, that is the mark. That is the metrics of if we really have a goodness culture or not. So at the risk of, again, TD Jakes does not know me from Adam. Let me make all that really clear. None of those people would have any clue of who I was. So it was fun as a young person, but it wasn't the real stuff of ministry. The real stuff was the ordinary, nitty gritty, hospital gowned ministry.
Yeah. Which is, I think most people, I don't know, I think most people go into ministry because that is what they want to engage with, right? I think most people, that is how it starts out, and they have a desire to be with people, weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who are rejoicing. And it's what we talked about a few weeks ago, that institution creep, right? How it is just so slow and subtle, because I really do feel that if most people knew it was happening, they would probably make another choice, or I do think that, and I think it just becomes so slow and insidious. And like you were just talking sort of about this idea of celebrity culture, I think a little bit, and we've heard a lot about that. It's part of what's been in headlines and stuff, as we've seen really prominent churches who have these big mega pastors, celebrities, and you look at Jesus and he was, sort of the anti-celebrity pastor. He was, the servant of all servants, right? And he kind of, he flipped that.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think I appreciate you sharing that.
No, absolutely. And I think you're up, it's true. I was listening recently to Dr. Chris Green. He's a theologian, Pentecostal theologian. And one of the things that he talked about, they mentioned that text where Jesus says, I didn't come to be served, but to serve. Mm-hmm. And I do think what he was after in what he was teaching was, we have to break the master-slave relationship and filter. Mm. And he says we have to break it not only with each other, but with God.
Right.
And I've always thought of that text, if I'm honest, in kind of like a one-time event, like, hey, let me just take a moment here and demonstrate what you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And then come and serve me. And he says, no, Jesus specifically says, I came to serve. And I think he said something to the effect that Jesus was, he's too big to be master. David Brooks, who they talk about a lot, he says, Alice had to become small to enter Wonderland. And I think that there's this idea of we want to grow big. And this is, whether it's on our Instagram follows or likes, or whether it's, how many people are following our sermons or this or that. And it's pervasive and it's easy to fall into the trap. But Jesus was trying to get us to be small. It really was this, how did you refer to it? The anti-celebrity thing, yeah. Right? He said, no, if you want to enter the kingdom, actually, it's harder for a rich person. In other words, it's harder for people who have accumulated and tried to make all this stuff upon themselves to make themselves big. He said it's harder for you to come into the kingdom than, a camel to enter through the eye of the needle. You have to become small. And so this is all of Jesus' teaching. And I think this is what the glory of God does, is it actually presses us down to become small enough to enter the kingdom so that our souls can expand. And this is the beautiful kind of irony of this, is when we become small, we become big. But it's not the same type of bigness. It's not celebrity big. It's, you have a big heart. You have a big and generous soul with resources from God, because you don't need celebrity. You're actually filled with God's own self. Like, what else do you need? But so I think it's just a sign of sickness when we digress from that, but to make ourselves big.
Yeah. So as we're kind of closing out this series, we've kind of naturally kind of flowed into that idea of Christlikeness, which I think we've been talking about like through all the weeks, because when we talk about things that we've talked about, empathy, compassion, grace, talking about people first, truth, justice, and service to one another, that's when a Tov culture emerges and we become more Christ-like. So all the culmination of kind of all these things that we've been discussing kind of results in that Christ-likeness. And David talked about this, I think this past week, about how, that's not to say we don't do things well, right? That's not to say that, we can't value, quality, or, value good music, or value good art and all that kind of stuff. But that when we have to choose one, and I really like that line that he said, that when we have to choose, when we will be held accountable to goodness, that's what we're going to be held accountable. So when we think about Christ-likeness as a community, I feel like that seems like we would say maybe that, oh yeah, well, that's obvious, or that seems like a really big idea. But how do you think practically? How do you think that, how do we do that? I guess it's just everything we've been kind of talking about. We don't want to go back all the way. Let's head back to the first session and go through everything again.
It's a real question, though, right?
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, just that I think it's such a great point, Kristen, because it's easy for a person like me to theorize. We could theorize about, I talk about cruciformity. I think they talked about Christiformity.
Yeah.
And we can talk about it, but what does it actually look like on the ground?
Yeah.
What are the examples? And, I think even some of the things that we're seeing now, and they do give some examples actually in a church called TOV, but it's also easy to focus on what it doesn't look like, but what does it look like? And I think I think what I'll say is, and I'm curious as to your thoughts, as to what you've seen or what you think, how we can move in that direction. I think we have to have a filter for, really, at the end of the day, I think the cross has to be the filter for how we understand ministry and even life. Otherwise, there will always be the temptation, and the temptation will come in weird ways, for us to lean toward those at the center and to elevate the people at the center and not elevate others, and to choose greatness over goodness. And I love that line too. I think that was such a great way to put it. But if you think even at the moment, and again, I hope I'm not taking us too far afield here, but there is times where we just don't want to ruffle any feathers and we don't want to make hard calls.
Yeah.
And sometimes we do this in the name of peace. And what we say is, hey, people are upset. This is not Christian unity, so it's not good.
Yeah.
And that always works for people in power, and it never works for the people at the margins. And so what actually we have to look and say, well, what actually, instead of, is it causing a disruption? Because the Spirit disrupts. The book of Acts, the book of Acts is one giant street riot after another. And this, I think people miss this. But the Spirit comes, the Spirit disrupts our systems to draw us back toward goodness. How can we discern it? And I think the way we discern it is by saying, which option here looks more like taking up a cross? And that will, I think what I'm learning, and probably too late in life, because I think I have contributed, and I'll tell you, it's easy to contribute to a greatness culture. But I think what I'm learning is that you have to be willing to set some things aside. You know what? I liked what they said, that in a greatness culture, every Sunday morning has to feel like it is the best thing that's ever happened, right? It's this show that has to be awesome all the time. If that is the case, there will be no space for interruption to do good work.
Yeah.
If the band can't interrupt their rehearsal because somebody else is hurting, or somebody in the band is hurting, you're like, you know what? I think we just need to love you, and I'm going to spend time with this person, and I guess we're done rehearsal. We'll see what happens Sunday. Like, if we can't make space for that, and then that means grace for each other. Like, that's the other part of this. And I'm talking way too much tonight, but like when I first went to the university, my work there is, you can't really walk any party line. You're falling off on one side or the other. And I realized that I was either going to be gripped by fear in my ministry there, fear of people saying you did that wrong on both sides of the fence. You should have done this, you should have done that. And so I had all these church people, proverbial church people on my shoulder. And I was paralyzed with fear. And then I realized, okay, these are complex issues in which there is no easy answer.
Yeah.
And I realized what I need, and what I think we all need, is a community of grace, rather than a community who says, the music wasn't good enough today. You made this decision in ministry. How could you do that? That's so terrible. You did this, you did that. We have to become people of grace. If we're not gracious with each other, and even when it's like, yeah, maybe you could have done it different, but there's a way in which we can be okay with that. And I think all those things are necessary to create this culture of goodness. I mean, again, that's a mouthful, but what do you think? What's it look like for you as am I okay to throw this back at you?
No, that's totally great. I had listened to a podcast this past week with Diane Langberg, is her name? Langberg. Yeah. She's a psychologist, and she specializes in trauma and abuse, but she has a book called Redeeming Power. And I love the way she spoke about redeeming power. And when I actually have the book, and you can kind of think of it from a psychological perspective when you're dealing with trauma and abuse, but she talks a lot about this idea of like the corruption of power, and that a lot of times systems become really sick because of this corruption of power. But the thing is, there's
Yes.
all kinds of power. Like power is God given. We were told to go out and we were told to rule the earth. That is power, right? And
Yep.
so we a lot of times view power as like the enemy and it being negative. But the thing is, it was a gift and it was a blessing, and that it continues to be so. But it's the corruption of the power, right? Because there's
Mm,
physical power, emotional power, financial power, spiritual power. And a lot of the time, when we have systems where one person holds all this power, it's really
yes.
difficult for that not to get corrupted. And
Totally.
she's got this beautiful line in the podcast where she says, "You want to know how easy it is for systems to like how badly systems can get corrupted? The system God designed wanted to kill his son. That's how badly
Mm,
systems can get corrupted." Um, but she talks about it in that the solution then is not, well, there should be no power. The solution then is power in a redeemed sense, caring for the least of these, bringing hope and love, and yielding my power to his, right? And having a community that consistently, individually and corporately yields power
yeah.
to to the head of the church, right, instead of viewing ourselves as the head of that church. And so I just really appreciated that. And so to me, that's really what's
Mm.
resonating with me. I think there's a lot of different things avenues we could go down, but to me, that's what's resonating with me this week. It is looking at power and how do we redeem that, right? How do we yield in that?
I'm going to get the book, Redeeming Power.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to recommend one since you recommended that. Andy Crouch, Strong and Weak. Same time.
Oh,
I think this is such an important conversation of what does it mean to have good power.
yeah.
I'm going to read that book though.
I'll read the book you just recommended. So it's good. I always love a good book recommendation.
Anything to buy another book. Like, I know I
So
have
true.
to now. So good.
That's great. Well, I've really enjoyed having this conversation today, Phil, and thank you for everyone who's kind of tuned in and joined us on these calls for this series. And yeah, I just really appreciate everything you've had to say here.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
It has. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you later.